Good evening for those that are located in Europe, and good morning for those that are in the US time zone or wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the panel discussion today, hosted by Rencore, where I will join up with two other celebrities from the SharePoint world and talking about what happened last week in Ignite. And I would like to introduce to you my two other guests here for today. And please, guys, could you please introduce yourself? Jussi, can you start?
Sure. So good evening, everybody, or good morning for those of you who are still starting your day. My name is Roine. I'm based in Helsinki, Finland. I'm a Microsoft MVP, Microsoft Regional Director, and I did ages ago the Microsoft Certified Master exams as well. And I've been using SharePoint from the very first versions, and I think I still do it daily.
And Jeremy Thake, I'm the VP of Product Technology at Hyperfish. I was an MVP before I joined Microsoft a few years ago, and then I left Microsoft after a 3-year stint on the Office 365 development team to go join Hyperfish back in the ISV space. So yeah, it's been an interesting being on the outside of all this news around Office 365 development, seeing what the team have done.
Okay, and then a little introduction about myself. I'm Erwin from Hunen. I obviously work for Rencore. Just like you see, I did ages ago that Certified Master exam, and I also work together in the with Vesa, Juvonen, among others, in the SharePoint PnP core team. Let me introduce a bit about the logistics for today. So in the Zoom application, you will be able to launch a Q&A. That will be the way to communicate with us. I will monitor the questions there, and we will try to answer them. So just type away there. You can obviously use the chat, but we prefer that you write the questions in the Q&A because that allows us to focus a bit better on the questions instead. And you can use the chat, obviously, to communicate with your fellow attendees. So we don't have slides, effectively, other than these ones. To confirm, because the question most likely will pop up, we are recording this one, and we will share this video with you after we completed this webinar. So let's start up. We actually have some video that we can turn on, so you can actually see us. So I will now stop sharing this slide deck, so you should be able to see at least me and Jeremy. Jussi was fortunately enough, well, I don't know, to not have a camera.
I suspect he's in his pajamas or something.
Something like that, most likely.
I think it's a blessing for you guys. So
Right. So, guys, you were like me. You were last week in Ignite. Besides the fact that it was, at least for me, I'm from Sweden, I'm not used to heat. It was insane, the temperature. It was mind-blowing for me. It was like walking into a sauna the moment you stepped outside. I don't know how you guys experienced that, but it was crazy.
I stayed for an extra 3 days afterwards, and once I was out of work mode of being on the kind of the booth and attending sessions and could actually wear shorts and not wear shoes, it was actually a lot more comfortable in the heat.
I can imagine that, yeah.
For me, coming from Finland, I'm used to the cold, and I think I'm used to the warmness as well. But in Florida, the weather is so humid.
It is.
When you go outside, it's like a poor sauna, but then you come back in and it's overcompensated with the AC. So it takes a few days to get used to it. Then when you go back home, you start hating the cold again.
Exactly. It didn't help personally for me, at least, that we basically had two big buildings, like the South Concourse and the West Concourse, and that you sometimes had to walk between the two of them. That was not really something I appreciated, so to say.
Yeah, I hope they change that for next year, because I was walking 8 to 9 miles a day.
It's ridiculous.
From the expo hall to a session, and then to get back to the expo hall to do another shift. So
yeah,
it was pretty brutal.
It was.
I had comfy Nikes on, and my feet are still killing me.
Right.
I was using my Fitbit device to track the steps, and I think I did about 18 to 20,000 steps per day.
Insane. Wow. It's very healthy, one could say, but
it's true.
Yeah.
And then they put soda everywhere, which completely
to compensate. True. Right. So compared to, I've been at basically all Ignites, the ones in Atlanta, one in Atlanta and one in Chicago. Actually, I think this one was the best personally. Maybe not the location, although the Atlanta one was quite okay, but the content-wise, I think this one was personally for me the most exciting one. The announcement, there were a lot of announcements. So I come very much from a developer background. So for me, I was focusing mainly on SPFX. I actually did a session about SPFX extensions in combination with PNP and site designs and those kind of things. So I'm very much into that area. That is really interesting me. I think it's a very exciting development. But have you been focusing on a specific topic, or have you been like generically just like a sponge, just take it, give it to me, and I'll just take everything in? Jeremy, what were you focusing on?
Yeah, I think from someone who's come from inside Microsoft and moved out, there was obviously a few areas for us at Hyperfish were interesting from a development perspective. But the big thing for me is it's very clear now that they're in a rhythm, not just the SharePoint team, but they're in this 6-month cycle of shipping. With the SharePoint team, they've now had this virtual conference for the last 2 years, kind of spread 6 months either side of the Ignite conference. And they, when I was there, they were targeting, okay, this is what we're doing for Ignite. This is what we're doing for the virtual SharePoint conference. This is what we're doing Ignite. And it seems like the rest of the dev stuff is done on the cadence of build. So it's build, Ignite, build, Ignite, build, Ignite. And they've really got into this rhythm of shipping like that. For the longest time, these guys were shipping every 3 years. Right? They were doing a major server release, and shipping at that point. And to go down and shrink that kind of cycle to almost 6 months has taken some time to get the muscle right for them. And I think they're in that groove now. And you could see that by the amount of releases that happen, not just in SharePoint, because I think that's probably the most of things I've seen announced in SharePoint ever, even over a 3-year major release in terms of features. Yeah. And so for me, I sat there going, man, what is Ignite next year going to be like when they're even more in their groove of being able to ship like this? And then on the dev side, the SharePoint framework stuff was really started to kind of grow. And I feel like with the reception it had at Ignite, that I need to eat my hat a bit. And I actually spoke to Dan Kogan and Vesa actually about this, because I was really skeptical about the framework being like a fourth dev model and what reception that was going to have to, SharePoint developers like you see have been in this space since the beginning of SharePoint, and seeing another framework come out or another dev model come out. Yeah. But it seems like people have really jumped on this JavaScript bandwagon and gone, no, this is what we've always wanted, and we wanted to get away from server-side code and be wherever web devs are. And they've kind of really forgiven Microsoft for doing the switcheroo on them from the add-in model and from sandbox solutions. And so that for me was like the biggest takeaway this week was, wow, like I'm glad I was pessimistic and challenging the team, and guys, you've got to be really careful about how you announce this stuff. But they've done a really good job of bringing existing devs forward, I think. And to be honest, a lot of it is what you and Vesa and the rest of the PNP core team do. But that was my major kind of grab from last week was, man, they've done a great job of that.
Actually, when you mention this now, when I compare the questions, because I've been doing booth duty, I was a booth babe at the Microsoft booth too. If I compare the questions I got compared from last year to this year, so last year it was on-prem, and very traditional development, server-side code, etc., and this year it was SPFX, cloud, SPFX. That was actually a huge shift, and that just happened in a year. I was actually pretty positively surprised by that. And just like you, in the beginning, I was a bit hesitant when they introduced like SPFX, like JavaScript. Will people think of JavaScript as mature enough? Is it an enterprise level environment that you can build applications in and solutions in? But they jumped, and for the better, because I think it is actually maturing nicely. It is actually, we're getting there. I don't think it's a full replacement yet, but we're getting there closely, and they're releasing so fast. Like the updates to the SPFX framework. I mean, last night a new one came out already, and bang, and they keep releasing, and it's growing and growing. So that's really exciting. What is your opinion, Jussi?
So SharePoint is probably the product that I know best, and it's the one I've been working with for 15 years, as well as Office 365 for years already. So when I go to an event like Ignites, I always feel that if I go and attend all the SharePoint sessions, they're probably around the stuff that I know much more about already. And if I go to something else, I might be forced to learn something outside of my comfort zone. Mm-hmm. So last year at Ignite, I think I did a lot of Azure Stack. I did a lot of Windows Server stuff together with SharePoint. So this year, I did a lot more on AI because that kind of seems to be the common theme nowadays, but also attending the SharePoint sessions as well as the development sessions, you could feel that SharePoint framework, everything around that, that's the thing where things are happening now. Mm-hmm. And people are really excited about it, not like with the add-in model or not even like in the full trust model back in the day.
Right.
So I would say that going there and just seeing the interest from people on all things around SharePoint, be it SharePoint 2019 announcement or just development, that was probably the biggest thing at Ignite.
Yeah, we did a global SharePoint survey. We've done it for 2 years now with ShareGate and Nintex. And just the numbers that we've seen in terms of how many of those customers that filled out the survey have moved to SharePoint Online or have a hybrid experience, it's gone up nearly 30% since last year. So my theory on that is that SharePoint Online reached its tipping point where although they are pushing things back down into SharePoint Server, the other question we asked is like how many people are on SharePoint 2016 versus 13, 10, 7, 3, 1. And there's a lot of people camping on 2010. And it seems like rather than waiting or upgrading to 2016, and I'm generalizing a bit because I actually spoke to customers that are doing the Server 2016 jump. A lot are going, you know what, we're just going to start all new team sites in SharePoint Online. And I think that jump to the cloud, because of all the new features like modern sites and the communication sites specifically, is enough to kind of, the gateway drug to get them into Office 365 and saying, no, we can only be on SharePoint Server. And I'm sure it's a little bit different where you guys are in Europe, but even in the survey, there was quite a lot of European people that filled out that survey that said that they were jumping in. And I think it's good timing for SharePoint to have, reset with a whole new user experience and a whole new development model, because, they've suddenly come from being this old laggard, oh my God, SharePoint, the first thing I want you to do is make it not look like SharePoint, to almost people are now saying, you know what, we actually like this and the branding and the styling's fine. We understand it's not good to bend SharePoint in this contortionist thing that breaks it when you go to upgrade. Like all those lessons now have made people realize they just use it as a product service and not try and use it as a bunch of Lego bricks on the UI side for sure.
There's a question here from Jens, and he asks, what about provided hosted apps? Are they dead? No. SharePoint hosted apps, that's a different story. I would not
with
invest.
Managed code, right?
Yeah. So provider hosted apps, absolutely not dead. CSOM, not dead. And there's still a lot of things you can only do in CSOM that you cannot do through the REST APIs with SPFX, for instance. Manage metadata.
For the provider hosted apps, I wouldn't say they're dead, but even before SPFX was available, I think it was fairly rare for companies to actually start building provider hosted apps. It would be something major that they would really need, like a site provisioning solution at the time.
Yeah.
So I think that still stands today. If you need something more complex, you might build that one, but now you have more possibilities with SPFX.
I position provider hosted apps in the area of like, do I need something like on-prem? Would I need like a timey job or something like that? That's where provided hosted app comes in. But all the rest of the stuff can most likely be done. And that's typically, if you compare the SharePoint development ecosystem, if you're building solutions, it's like web parts and then it's server-side components that do things in the backend. All that backend stuff that is still has a place in provided hosted apps, and all the rest web parts, that's all SPFX.
Yeah, I think the other division, which obviously isn't as common because I'm assuming most people on this are from kind of customers that are building customizations on SharePoint, is for provider hosted apps, one of the big things that immediately kind of leapt up when we started looking at the architecture of the SharePoint framework is the security model differences. So essentially, you've got a shared identity if you deploy anything via the SharePoint framework. And so for Hyperfish as a vendor to build a web part, and then for Contoso Inc. to build a web part, they can technically, whatever we're calling in our web part, they can call as well because there's no isolation.
Yeah.
Whereas in provider hosted, because they use nasty iframes and they have a different application identity that other iframes on a page can't use, there is true security isolation in your customizations. And so for like large enterprises where security is like the utmost concern, provider hosted is always going to be needed. So that's kind of the security thing is a big deal. And then the other aspect of it is go to Redmond and try and find someone that's working on provider hosted add-ins. Not many.
No.
If any. I've not been down there for a little bit, but even when the SharePoint framework was announced, like pretty much if you were finding bugs or anything in provider hosted, there was no one in the core team working on this stuff. So it's a good indication there's no new investment.
When you look at the API side, for instance, now we have the modern communication side, the modern team side. They will not release any CSAM APIs to create those. Sorry, so you will not be able to create those site collections, for instance, through an out-of-the-box CSAM. And what is happening there in the community is that we from P&P are actually now building the code that allows you to create them from CSAM.
Yeah.
And because what they are focusing on is the REST API. That is their, and that makes actually a lot of sense from a development perspective, from their perspective, and from their cost efficiency. It makes a lot of sense because it's much easier to maintain for them. There's only one endpoint they have to update instead of making sure that there's a distribution of assemblies going all over the world and being released and downloadable and version management, etc. So from their perspective, it makes a lot of sense to do it. And but that also means there will be no big investments in CSAM. There will be every month new releases that you can use in your provided hosted apps. There will be fixes, small updates, but nothing big coming out in CSAM anymore. It's all going to be a REST.
Also one thing with provider hosted apps, oftentimes you would need a developer to actually implement the application, but then you would need the IT pro to actually deploy and configure the certificates and make the whole thing be available for users.
Yep.
And now with the more modern sites and SPFX, the developer can more or less do everything in there. And
apart from the deployment,
the IT pro.
Apart from
the actual deployment of the package, But there's a lot more complexity to provider hosted that really did block that in enterprises for sure when we first announced all that stuff.
There are things coming too, by the way. There will be functionality to actually provision and activate a provided hosted app. That's coming.
Yeah, I think the big surprise for people that are kind of straddling both worlds was that having the ability for the SharePoint framework web parts to run in SharePoint Server 2016 Feature Pack 2 was a kind of a nice kind of way for enterprise developers that are on 2016, which in all honesty, based on the survey, based on conversations I'm having, isn't that many people.
No.
But it is nice that if you are in that way, that you can start building for this framework and prepare yourself for the cloud. And I know it kills me to say that because it's what I said 3 years ago when I was at Microsoft about the add-in model. Get off of full trust solutions, get off of sandbox solutions, and use the add-in model to be cloud ready. And I think the reality now is that if you're starting fresh, the framework, for the most part, is enough that you could start there and be ready to move to SharePoint Online. And there's some scenarios that surprised me that weren't announced this week. Single page applications with the SharePoint framework. I remember being shown that a long time ago, and I'm not sure why that hasn't been prioritized. They're clearly not getting the feedback from people on it. And so if you want to kind of launch an application from SharePoint and go full page as a single page app, provider host is the way to go for that still at the moment.
Yeah.
But that was the only big kind of like, oh, wow, I'm surprised that still hasn't been announced.
Yeah, true. there's a question here. In the REST API, what is Microsoft suggesting when comparing the Microsoft Graph API versus the Search API versus the List API? And then I can probably add another few APIs there. Yeah. Any ideas?
Knowing how this is all built, the Microsoft Graph is essentially, for lack of a better word, a proxy to all the product services that sit within Office 365.
Yeah.
So when an API is released, like the List REST API that allows you to create, read, update, delete from SharePoint, the Microsoft Graph team went, great, we can now put the List API on the Microsoft Graph under whatever they decide as a nomenclature. And essentially when you call a graph, it's actually proxying that call directly to SharePoint lists. And so what happens is those native products, REST APIs, will always come out before they get put on the Microsoft Graph. So there's always a lag between it coming out and then coming on the Graph. And obviously introducing a whole new service on the Graph, like Planner, for instance, or Teams, onto the Graph takes even longer because there's a bunch of, okay, well, how have you done your auth in this product, and how have you done this, and how have you done that? Microsoft got better at making sure that when new products spin up, that they use the same kind of authentication and API structure that other products have done, so the Graph's easier to hook them in. But you're going to get a little bit better speed by calling the product REST APIs than you are calling the Microsoft Graph. That's definitely one thing. But the nice part about the Graph is that once you've kind of authenticated to the Graph and consented and requested the correct permissions to whatever services you want, you're away at the races. And so it's kind of it definitely makes it cleaner if you're just using one endpoint than trying to use all the different product service endpoints, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree on that one. So at Ignite, they announced the SharePoint List APIs for Graph as generally available. And the guidance that I'm seeing and the guidance that I feel developers are more happy with is that if you have a need for an API, start and see what's available in the Graph already, because that's a consistent way of working, be it SharePoint, be it Planner, be it Teams or something else. And then if you do something that is specifically for SharePoint and the Graph doesn't have that capability, of course, use the List API or the Search API or whatever have you in there.
Yeah. I think the other aspect of it is by using the Graph rather than SharePoint APIs, it means that, you know, if you're a believer, and I think there's a lot of people out there, that SharePoint might not always be the presentation layer for every single thing you do. Whereas 6 years ago, it was kind of like every business application, build it in SharePoint. You know, let's create a SharePoint site collection, let's build the application in SharePoint. Whereas now what you're seeing, and very much so from a lot of the sessions at Ignite, and it is a little bit schizophrenic from Microsoft at the minute, and I think they're going to find their way by the next Ignite, is that if you go speak to the Microsoft team, as in Microsoft Teams product, which was, you know, is new, they'll tell you, go build a tab and build your business application there. If you go speak to Yammer team, Yammer will go build your application here and connect into Yammer in that way. And if you go talk to the Outlook team will go build an Outlook add-in and build your business application in Outlook. And I think by learning the Microsoft Graph as an API layer rather than each individual product service, they all support the Graph. They all support the authentication of the Graph. So you learn one API and you can use it no matter what presentation layer you decide to service your business application. And I think over time, you'll realize that different personas in your company or within your customer base prefer Outlook over Teams, over SharePoint as a way of working with their business application. I think it's going to be really interesting to see how Microsoft position that next year, for sure.
One thing they also released is the Graph extensions for Azure Functions. And that brings in a nice bridge from OneDrive, Excel, Outlook, or some other application that needs to get access to Graph, but you don't want to implement it manually within the app. So now you can use the serverless platform, the Azure Functions, build it in there, and that simply calls the Graph for you. So I'm actually seeing, even today, with some customers that they don't want to spend time with SharePoint anymore. They are building their intranet, their productivity environments in Teams. I'm not sure if that's the best platform for it, but at least it's fairly easy.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you think about the biggest, most common productivity clients for people in Office 365 is Outlook and it's Skype for Business in most cases. And SharePoint isn't in that top two. And it's primarily because they're desktop client. SharePoint doesn't have a desktop client. And I think that's where, Teams is going to do well, especially being as Skype for Business has been announced that it's not going to be a client for very much longer. Microsoft Teams is going to replace it. So I think that was a really good power play internally by that team to make that happen, to suddenly get this huge flux of users. So it's going to be interesting to see SharePoint developers that are using the SharePoint framework, how much attention they pay to Microsoft Teams development, because there's some really nice stuff around bots in there, and the tab development, as well as what they can do inside of SharePoint as well.
And I've seen a couple of SharePoint developers now move from SPFX or add-in development to do more Power Apps, because then they can embed those Power apps within Teams or now in SharePoint as well. So there's more choice really now for the technology.
So the interesting question here, asking, has Yammer a future in Office 365 or replaces Teams the Yammer service? Yeah.
The vision that we were given at Ignite for Yammer is that's the outer loop. That's for the external people. And today I do realize or understand that that's the way it goes for now, since with Teams, the external guest access is fairly limited still. But in the future, when it becomes more like what we have with Skype for Business now, I would say that Yammer has a future, but it will be a smaller future than today.
You can also imagine if you, and this, Ralph writes that here in the chat, it is a different use case. I mean, if you look at Yammer, you can easily participate in a Yammer group, or whatever you want to call it, with like thousands of colleagues. That works in that environment. I don't want to do that in a team. It's impossible.
Yeah. I actually interviewed Dan Holm on our Hypish podcast on the Monday at Ignite. And I asked him about that because I was like, is Yammer dead? Like, we've kind of got over the point that SharePoint isn't dead anymore. Like pretty convinced with all the effort that's gone into the announcements at Ignite, SharePoint is not going to be killed. And I think even Ignite this year, it made me kind of realize, wow, yeah, Yammer's not dead either. And the inner and outer loop thing, there's a few people that try and explain this. But honestly, Dan Holm does the best job of articulating it. So if you're interested in that, just go over to the Hyperfish podcast. It was like the last show that we produced, and he does a really good job of explaining. And it actually wasn't him. Inner and outer loop was actually Satya Nadella. He pitched it at a keynote at an internal Microsoft Field conference, and the marketing team heard that it was resonating well with the internal field. And so they grabbed it, and then now they've basically made it mainstream messaging of how you explain when to use Yammer versus Teams versus SharePoint versus group DLs. And I think the biggest thing to answer it on Yammer is that now that they've built the Yammer web part that embeds into SharePoint pages, that allows you to kind of do commenting on communication news and into team sites, I think it's found a home where it makes sense. And obviously communicating out loud in the open, like Erwin just said, is the other scenario that it's very common for. That really, even if Microsoft Teams supported having a team with everyone in the organization in it, the UI isn't built for that. Whereas Yammer's UI is built for having thousands and thousands of people comment in a way that is easier to follow than it would be in Microsoft Teams. So I think, yeah, it does have a fit. It's found somewhere to be totally in survival mode as a web part in SharePoint. And they've got real close with SharePoint because Dan Holm in the marketing team owns OneDrive, SharePoint, and Yammer. And so it's not going to die now. And they found one home where they're in survival mode via the comment web part. And I think they're going to find more as well moving forward.
There's a question here that I actually have no clue to answer, but I will ask it anyway. Is ZURB Foundation still needed for responsive SharePoint Online sites? I'm not aware of what ZURB Foundation is, to be honest.
Yeah. So the only reason I know this is because it was asked when I was there, Microsoft. So the responsiveness if you're using the modern sites are responsive by design. And it was one of the reasons they kind of bit the bullet, burnt, a few cycles of releases to build a new presentation layer for SharePoint. And so the responsive design aspect of SharePoint Online now, if you're using a modern site, means that you don't need to add responsive frameworks on top to make it look nice in a mobile, to make it look nice on a high or a low res screen. And so essentially, the answer there is if you're still using classic sites, sure, you're going to have to break some master pages and page layouts to get it responsive, even with some of the additional things they did in classic sites to help. But from a responsive side, the modern sites is certainly there.
Which is also one of the reasons they actually took away quite some things from modern sites, like the
Right.
ability to inject JavaScript yourself, custom actions, those kind of things, because they will break the whole responsive experience.
Yeah, and get rid of ActiveX controls and all that jazz.
The ZERP, I've never used that one, but Erwin, wasn't it so that within the PNP releases, I think you did the responsive template thingy last year?
We have a responsive add-on in PNP, which is effectively a custom action that gets registered in the site that provisions or injects a JavaScript file into the page that makes the SharePoint site relatively responsive. Not fully, but quite responsive. So the menu, the quick launch slides out when needed and changes size, and there will be a hamburger menu introduced for the quick launch, that kind of stuff. So it does make your site responsive-ish.
I can see a follow-up question from Ralph there on, but doesn't SharePoint support Teams? I think this is where SharePoint still I think it was in survival mode a little bit because Teams is getting a lot of traction internally at Microsoft and also a lot of buzz from the media as well. It's the new person on the block in Office 365, and I'm finding customers start with Microsoft Teams now once they've got their mailboxes over, whereas before it's kind of like, let's do our mailboxes and then let's move our SharePoint stuff in. Now there's this really kind of quick win of saying, let's just let people create Microsoft Teams and have places to communicate as a project team. And yes, SharePoint can be a part of that because SharePoint is a intranet, and it's also a content service that can be used by other products within Office 365. So when you go in the Files tab in Teams, it is SharePoint under the covers because it's provisioning an Office 365 group. And so it's using all the undercover content services of SharePoint to do that. But I think what I was trying to say was that you can start in SharePoint and have SharePoint as your first experience as an end user. And obviously that way as a developer, you're building web parts and things directly into the page. Or you could start your experience in Microsoft Teams and have a Files tab and have a tab that is a SharePoint page that you've got as an application. But Teams would be your launching ground for it. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of differences in opinion in the next year, I think. And I'd be interested to see at Ignite what that balance is SharePoint the landing page or is Teams the landing page? And, does SharePoint just come under and be almost a content service that you don't even know it's SharePoint? And that would be kind of my recommendation as a developer, if you're a SharePoint dev guy right now, is don't ignore Microsoft Teams as a development platform and keep abreast of where that's going.
Okay, I see, totally unrelated, but I see some remarks in the chat that my volume is quite low. I moved the slider a bit more to the right, so I hope this will fix it, that I'm a bit, better, good. Question here from Jens. He's asking about power user concept. It's getting more focused with Flow and Power Apps and all third-party functionality. Is custom code development tending more for product companies rather than consultants for custom code development? I don't think so, actually. I do see, and of course, I mean, the whole idea behind SharePoint or the future of SharePoint you see is that like citizen development, people can actually be active and decide things themselves and create functionality relatively easy. With that comes a risk, is that you don't know what's out there effectively. People can go crazy. It's like with a flow, it's very easy to actually share data with the outside world without you being aware of it as an administrator. So, yeah, you have to. But if you ask, it's like, that's where we're going, and it's product companies that build solutions? No, necessarily. I don't think so. No. Consultants still have very much a place in this game.
The the power user concept, the citizen developer concept, it kind of reminds me a bit on the good old days when we had Visual Basic 6. You would have this power user kind of accidental developers who would build these amazing internal tools, and then the company would keep on using those for 15 years because nobody knew how to fix it anymore.
Yeah.
So now with Flow and Power Apps, I feel that we have a platform that is contained and sandboxed in a sense that we can allow the power users to build their stuff that they need. And for all sorts of different tools, we don't need to hire this holy developer who knows how to do it and he has time next year for 2 hours to actually do it for us. Mm. So custom code development, I don't think it's only for product companies, but it's becoming a bit more complex because you need to do JavaScript, you need to know the tool chain, you need to know a bit about Azure, and the power user doesn't really need to know anything. You just need to know how to click and get started.
Yeah. I think if you look at the lessons learned from InfoPath, and obviously there are a lot of lessons learned from InfoPath.
Some painful too.
Right. I always used to kind of quote the 80-20 rule, which, for best part is, not far from the truth, which was that, you could build the most amazing prototype of InfoPath to get a business application to do a demo in front of an executive, to get buy-off, to get some funding internally to go build that business application. And then you would take that prototype and you thought, it'll only be a little bit of extra work and we'd have this thing live. Then you realized, oh crap, InfoPath doesn't allow me to do X, Y, and Z. And then you leapt to the last 20% where in certain cases you could hack away and you could get Visual Studio and break open InfoPath and have custom managed code inside the InfoPath form and go down that road. But sometimes you were still left with 10% you couldn't do. And at that point, you're at this tipping point of, I got to rebuild this thing completely as an ASPX web application. I think with where this custom code is going with Power Apps and Microsoft Flow, it's similar. But what they've done is the difference between being a citizen developer that is using Power Apps and Flow and just configuration inside of those products to them going, I can't do this out of the box, and wanting custom code to get to as close to damn it as 100% as you can, is the transition is a lot more comfortable than it would have been with InfoPath. And so, I mean, sure, most developers, like true developers in a sense, they write, .NET or JavaScript code. You can't even say compile code anymore because JavaScript doesn't really compile. But people that live in code, not in VB6, but in a real IDE, might not be comfortable with kind of taking someone's Microsoft Flow or Power Apps project and getting it to the end line to 100%. But I think because they've done it with Azure Functions and Azure support, I don't think it'll be as painful for a developer to be like, take that and go, okay, I'll add these 2 extra features and we'll get this thing live. Whereas, if you took an InfoPath form to someone 8 years ago and went, I'm at 80%, I need you to do these 2 things to get it to 90%, can you go do it? There would have been a lot of expletives in that conversation. So I think it's not just for vendors. I definitely think there's a scenario of getting you from 80 to 100 that enterprise developers will need to do. Power Apps is definitely getting a lot of traction in the ecosystem now as well. There are a lot of enterprise devs picking it up. I follow on with a very old good friend of mine, Paul Colmsey, that's based in Australia. He's been doing 3-day workshops in Asia Pacific around Power Apps. And he keeps sharing these videos of what people build with these things. And it's blown me away at the business applications that can be built in it. So, again, don't think Power Apps equals InfoPath would be my advice there.
No. Could it be that Microsoft will deprecate some REST APIs? To answer that from my perspective, it could be. But you have to understand what deprecation means and how the concept of deprecation is different between the various products within the Microsoft tool set. Deprecation can mean it will disappear in a month. It means it will disappear in a year. It means we will not support it anymore. It will never disappear. That can also be deprecation because it's a very broad concept. What you see mainly is that they just stop developing things. Basically, but still be around for you to consume. You can safely assume that they will announce deprecation.
I remember in May they announced that the Office Graph query language APIs, which are REST API based,
will be deprecated.
they were discontinued or deprecated at the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
So the question I think is fair in the sense that probably something will be deprecated in the future, but for now everything is as it is.
It's a living API. Things change, insights change. Yeah. So yeah, it might happen. Yeah. Yanni asks here, Teams, will it replace Skype for Business within 2 years? Safe to assume, I think.
I would say so. Now that Teams is the primary client from now on, and Skype for Business client will probably not receive that many new features in the future.
The Mac one hasn't been receiving it for 3 years.
And the next version of Skype for Business on premise is the 2019 version, which is coming next year. That is supposed to have the Teams coexistence hybrid functionality. And I think it's a tip of the hat to those customers who have invested heavily in the on-prem SFB with regards to audio conferencing and integrations. But to Yanni's question, I would say now is the time to start planning ahead for Teams.
Yeah, you can tell there's been a lot of thought put through this process. This isn't a simple Microsoft have just announced it and gone, everyone's going to move to Teams. Like, they've been very good with the research, and I know customers that were in Redmond talking to them, and Microsoft were like gauging how annoyed they'd be by this kind of move. And that's why there's whole websites around planning this move and lots of controls around how you roll out. I mean, for them in a general session at Ignite to spend 20 minutes talking about the controls of how you can deploy Teams and do the change management and the communication planning to your employees from Skype for Business. These guys realize it's sensitive, but it's Pandora's box, or sorry, it's the, not Pandora's box, it's the Trojan horse, right? Like, they get Teams in there as a replacement for Skype for Business for text and video. And then all of a sudden it's like, surprise, you've also got all this other stuff that you get as part of Microsoft Teams. And organizations are concerned around that. 2 years, I think it's going to be shorter than that based on the way Microsoft have been pretty aggressive on it. I don't think customers are going to like it. There definitely won't be any new changes in Skype for Business. And as I say, jokingly, the Mac client's a good example of that. Like, it's always been crap. They've never fixed it. And it's because that team's been focused on Microsoft Teams. So that would be my gut feel is that you're going to feel a lot of pressure from Microsoft and your Microsoft reps to move off of Skype for Business if you're on Office 365 for sure.
I put in the chat the resource link from Fast Track for
that's
the
awesome.
planning and adoption guidance for moving to Teams. And one thing when I was reading through those, one thing about the promises what Teams is going to get is that the parity of Teams features compared to Skype for Business won't happen until maybe second half of next year. So that's the guidance I'm giving to my customers, that yes, Teams is really, really great, but look at the features that you have now, and if there's something you need that is only available in Skype for Business.
Right. I would like to jump to a question that Jens writes here about Teams, and then we can go to some other questions here. He asks, will Teams be opened up for external users? That's already the case, actually.
Well, kinda.
Yeah, but you have guest access, and that is you require an Office 365 account for that. So it's not like the public world, you can just invite everyone. No. Yeah. And there are some limitations there. It only works, at least I haven't got it to work on the mobile client. I only got it to work in the desktop client and in the web browser, but not in the mobile client.
Yeah, and for now it seems that if you get an invitation as an external to join a team, in your Teams client, you actually have to switch between different identities in that sense.
Yeah.
And I am now seeing that in my Outlook. So in my Outlook, I have a Skype for Business meeting and a Teams meeting. When I click the Teams meeting, it does this fancy invitation in the calendar that I would like to have the meeting over Teams. But when the other participant is trying to join, they're not really seeing anything before they're actually part of the group that the Teams meeting is happening in.
Right. They will get there. but it's not there yet. Andreas asks a question. He says, do I understand it correctly if you say that the business for solution building companies is dead? No.
Nope.
No. You didn't, unfortunately, Andreas, but you didn't understand it correctly. the business is not dead.
Maybe I was a bit too strong on how easy it is to build business applications in Power Apps, but no. Don't think power users can be able to do everything without having a developer involved, that's for sure.
No.
There's a question from Stephen on the possibilities to administrate groups and teams by PowerShell, and now you need the old modules. Is there anything happening on this side? I was just researching something along these lines this week for a customer. So if you go with the Azure AD preview PowerShell module, it has a few new commandlets for managing groups, the group naming policy, as well as the expiration policy. So that's something you do get since Ignite. And I recall seeing at Ignite in one of the Teams sessions that they did push out the Teams PowerShell commandlets as part of the Sky for Business online module.
Okay, cool. Will Power Apps become the citizen developer tool to build cool info path-like forms? And if there is an info path successor? Not for Microsoft. There is, it's Power Apps. Maybe the Forms product could fill some gaps, but they're both not at the level of InfoPath, and it's very unlikely. At least that's my personal conclusion, that there will be another Forms solution from Microsoft, which is like equivalent to what you could do with InfoPath. No.
Counting all the Forms products we have today, we have forms.office.com from the education side also now on normal tenants. And I'm seeing a lot of customers really happy with that because they need to do a simple form, add some logic with flow with the replies, and that's it. And then I think we still have the SharePoint surveys, the really old classic surveys.
Right, indeed. Yeah, they're still.
And then some people are still doing SharePoint custom lists. So they simply add the side columns and ask people to fill them out.
I see we have a famous guest actually just attending.
Yeah, I just saw Vesa just dropped in. I like the typo in your GitHub, Vesa. That was quite funny. It didn't say title, it said something else without the, yes.
Sure.
On Andrew Connell's tweets if you're interested in what I'm talking about.
If Vesa wants, he can join us. He's more than welcome. But Matt asks me if he wants to join. I don't know if Vesa says yes or no. That's up to him. So he can correct us in everything we just made up.
On the Power Apps thing, I think in Microsoft's mind, they're being very careful to say isn't an InfoPath replacement. Because there are just certain things in InfoPath that, Power Apps isn't going to do. I've worked with customers before in the past with InfoPath where basically they digitized manual entry forms, and essentially what that meant is that InfoPath became the replacement for that. And Power Apps really isn't about me being able to fill out a form, fill out a form, and inside of InfoPath, print it, sign it manually, and scan it and send it through. Power Apps is very much, whatever presentation layer in, whether we're in mobile or desktop, it's a data entry aspect and a business application, but it's not really meant to be like something that can be printed and seen this exactly the same presentation as what it's seen in InfoPath. And so it's definitely one example where that kind of forms thing is not being a replacement, and you might want to look at something like Adobe PDFs for things like that in the future.
I want to answer a question that Ralph asked actually quite a while ago. Sorry, Ralph, that you had to wait a bit on that one. He says, why bother to create a provided hosted app anymore? Well, there's still a lot of things you can't do in SPFX. And for those, you will have to fall back to the add-in model, e.g. CSAM. Managed metadata is one of those, for instance.
Yeah, the other thing is that...
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, continue, Jussi.
Yeah, with provider hosted apps is that if you do server-side coding, that's what you do. And moving to SPFX might be, for certain developers, be a big step in moving to client-side. Okay, Vesa, go.
No.
I think you guys covered that pretty okay as well. But I think it comes down
okay.
on what do we mean with provider-hosted ad? What is a provider-hosted ad or add-in or whatever it doesn't? What do we want to call that? Is it something which is running in Azure? Do we call that provider-hosted add-in? If we do, you'll write those in the future as well, because you'll call on web API from your SharePoint framework solution to get outside of your browser limitation. If we explicitly mean the provider-hosted add-in as a ACS level of an approval, you probably still might actually do that, because you do iframe isolation from a security perspective. Some customers might not like the JavaScript being running on the browser. And again, one of the favorite topics of Jeremy, no doubt, at least some point. Got you. But there's options, and we're looking into investing on the provider-hosted add-in model still. So you're able to use the SharePoint framework tooling and UIs in your adding web part, and the idea would be even that the iframe would be responsive, and at that point it will give you the isolation. You don't have access on the let's say on the identity of the user or the additional things as the user has, but it will be almost like a SharePoint framework solution. Not yet, it's not yet there yet, but we're planning to do that at some point.
I saw a question briefly pop up and then it disappeared, and the question was, is the workflow engine, is that one dead?
I answered that via text. I think.
Okay. Thank you. What did you answer?
Let me see. So,
did you say yes?
Yes. So what I did put in there is the workflow manager mainstream support end date is early 2018. However, it is supported with SharePoint 2013 and 2016 with respect to those SharePoint mainstream support end dates. So what we are seeing now is that Flow in the cloud, Logic Apps as part of Azure, they're really kind of the spiritual successors. But for on-premises SharePoint, you either go with Workflow Manager or you choose something else.
Yeah, and I can see Jonas has asked, does Nintex still have a business case, or will Flow take over totally? This might come across a little bit biased because the Hyperfish CEO is the founder of Nintex, but it's something that came up a lot last week, and I think it's fair to answer this on behalf of Nintex, is that, Flow is only going to go so far. Nintex has got a extremely large team focused on this and has been in this industry for a long time. Much has K2 and a bunch of other things. And so, for Office 365 subscribers, sure, you can use Power Apps and Microsoft Flow for a lot of business scenarios, but there are going to be things that, Flow isn't going to get to at the enterprise level, but even on a usability level that Nintex has got to, because it's been in this space so long. We're actually doing a fair bit of work at Hyperfish with the extensibility aspects to have activities in Nintex workflows that you can't do in Microsoft Flow in the same way. So I don't think that's going away. Brian's still coming in smiling to the office, so you got to assume that their business is going well.
One quick story around the Flow and Logic Apps. I needed to build something that was a bit more complex. I started building that with Flow. I ran out of the capabilities. I promoted that to a Logic Apps. And in the end, after spending a couple of days building a custom solution, I found out that for all the really specific complex stuff, I needed to run custom code in Azure Functions or API apps or something else. And in the end, I had this huge Frankenstein's monster kind of workflow that was mostly custom code. So I see Nintex with big opportunities for that if they can provide enough actions, enough capabilities in there.
Yeah.
Now that we have Vesa on board, welcome Vesa. Nice to see you again. There is a question here that actually I think is the perfect question for you. How is the SPFX extension growing?
Ooh.
Roadmap.
SPF. The SharePoint framework extensions. Yes. So right now, obviously, we're looking into the GA happened a week ago. So right now, the first steps are more around the announcements, which we did last week. So by end of this year, there would be the additional craft support. There will be ALM APIs to deploy a solution, all of that. So kind of a stuff which is outside of the core extensions, so to say. But obviously, in the extension side, we're looking into having support for editing forms, and also, well, editing forms is the major deal. And also the list view web parts should be supporting that natively in the modern UIs and all of that. But it takes a while for, it's multiple teams, and it takes a while for those teams to catch up as well. Are we looking into having additional placeholders? Yep, there's quite a lot of requests on that one in user voice. Please keep on that feedback coming as well, so we can actually prioritize our tasks based on that. But I can't say anything kind of a super specific or a date what would happen on a certain time frame.
Okay. Connected to the SPFX question, what is Microsoft's commitment to unit tests with SPFX? It seems like the framework is designed with them, but the default Microsoft SharePoint Yeoman generator does not necessarily create a unit test.
I love Vesa's expression right now.
So we know. So we want to enable the unit testing for the SharePoint framework solutions. Now, this is, unfortunately, it's one of those things. It's a matter of priorities, getting stuff released, getting deployed, and all of that. Now we are at G8 with an extension. We do not have, let's say, as massive functionalities as web part and extensions in the pipeline, so we can concentrate more on getting the basics again more polished, like the unit testing. So we know we'll make it happen. We know. I'll send an email reminder to Pete. You don't know which Pete and who Pete, but Pete is the guy who's responsible of this. So.
Okay, send a mail to Pete. Okay.
Yes, Pete is my engineer responsible of that one. So.
Make sure you red bang that email, Vesa.
But the cool thing, I think, is now that when you say it might happen, it could happen next month. I'm not saying that it will happen, but now with the increased release cycles, or basically just release when it's ready, get it out there. It's incredible. That's wonderful. It's so different from the old world where we had to wait 3 years for a change, or maybe if we're lucky, it came up in a service pack or a CU.
And also be able to drive it and prioritize and give the feedback. Like that never happened in the old days. I mean, it did to a very small group of NDA'd people, whereas now everyone that's a SharePoint developer can contribute to it, which is great.
Yeah. And that's no doubt our intention in the future as well. And that's, for example, just an example, we had a community call earlier today where we showed the upcoming site design and the site scripting capabilities and how they are currently working. It's a preview capability. Nobody has access, but we walked through the whole design. It's not an NDA thing. So, and people can actually provide us feedback. So why wouldn't we show that? As long as we are being explicit on that's a preview and that's coming and this is what we're planning to do. So it will be beneficial for everybody. So it's good that we are evolving from let's say, a closed company to a completely open company, hopefully, or gradually, let's put it this way.
Jens has a question based on trusting apps. How will it impact the complete security model, and what are I open up for services to read and create my company's data?
Feel free.
I'm trying to understand the question. It's like
I think this is
the app trust model, but
it's what I was saying before about the provider-hosted add-ins and me being iframed and security isolated, so that my app, when I register it in Azure AD, has permissions to certain things and also can call back into other services I've got in Azure Functions, or maybe an app service, or even something on premises. I guess you can't isolate those calls in SPFX. If there are other SPF web parts on a page, you'll be able to kind of call into the APIs one other web part's calling into, unless I'm missing something from the announcements I said. But I think architecturally that will never happen, right?
No, that's correct. And the question might be also that, hey, if I give these permissions to those apps, will they have the permissions? And the answer is yes. That's the whole permission model. So technically, if you provide a tenant level, farm level, or tenant level permission for a provider hosted adding, it can access your tenant without you being present there. And
we're adding another person.
Yeah. Okay.
We're about to add another person actually to the discussion. It's going to be really, really interesting.
Should we just add all the attendees as present?
Let's do that. Russell, in the meantime, is asking a question. What about Office 365 SharePoint workflows? Or will they lose support?
No.
That was a very European answer. I love it.
I dare to say it's a Finnish answer.
It's a Kimi Räikkönen answer, right?
Yeah, the Finnish answer would be no, and don't ask me again.
Yeah. Officially, we would actually end this call in a minute from now, but we just decided to continue because there's good questions coming in. There's a lot of people interested in asking questions, so we just decided to run on. So don't assume we will drop out in a minute from now.
Regarding the app permissions question that we had before, I was just setting a new Office 365 tenant yesterday with a customer, and I showed them on the projector how to use the Graph Explorer. So initially, when you start using it, you sign in, it gives you the consent with this huge list of permissions that it requires. Normally, you just hit OK and let's start doing it. But the customer was asking me, so what do we really do here? What kind of permission am I giving here? So there's still people who actually read through the permissions in their mobile apps when they install something like a Pokemon Go to see what's really happening here.
Which would be the smart thing to do, right? Because you are consenting that application with those permissions.
To do something on your,
Exactly.
Yeah, we actually, with what we announced at the conference as in Hyperfish, part of our thing with our consent screen is we realize with our customers, they do read this stuff. And so when you first try our product, we only require read directory profiles as a consent. And it's only at the point where we want to write back the profile photo into Active Directory that then we go, okay, and now we need write consent. And so you have the ability to progressively build the consent you require rather than kind of scaring your user base right up front and go, we need everything. Obviously, Microsoft Graph is a little bit of an edge case because it's just a demonstration thing, and I wouldn't recommend running the Graph Explorer against a production tenant. Not a good idea. But yeah, definitely be considerate of what you actually really need users to consent to, because otherwise you'll get people that will basically be too scared to click OK and confirm. And so just kind of gradually ask for it as you need it is my recommendation.
Right. SharePoint 2019 was announced.
It was announced, yes, it did.
Any feelings about what it will be like? And I'm not asking, I know, Vesa, you might know a tiny bit more about that, but you don't have to disclose that. But and there is Waldek. There is Waldek.
We missed you at Ignite, Waldek.
Yeah, we missed you.
Yeah, so I've heard. So apparently, as I don't know anything about it, what was announced, guys? What did I miss?
Nothing. I've been listening to this webinar, dude. Come on.
So that's timing, right? I mean, that's evening time, so kids, family, first things first.
Erwin, regarding SharePoint 2019, I wasn't surprised about the announcement because it's the good time to do the announcement now, but I am seeing so many customers moving from SharePoint 2010, 2013 to SharePoint Online.
Yeah.
So 2019, I'm seeing that as Sky for Business 2019. It is something to get hybrid up and running, but that's about it.
Well, no, which is true within, but I would say it depends on the region of the world. In Scandinavia, no doubt. Well, we are ex-colleagues with Jussi, and we help people to move to cloud while we were working at the same time in Microsoft. But in Scandinavia, everybody is already in cloud, so nobody is investing in on-premises. On the other hand, if we go to the Central Europe or US, there's a lot of people who are looking into on-premises. Even in Ignite, there was a lot of people who were dropping by in the booth, asking stuff around the PMP or the modern experiences, and then saying, we will never go to the cloud. Well, it might be true, or they might be changing their mind in a few years. But for them, having the modern experiences, all of that stuff potentially coming to on-premises as part of 2019 is a massive deal. Because they want to have all of the things what we are now showing in SharePoint Online in on-premises. And what it will be explicitly, well, technically, we don't even know at this point. Obviously, we have our desires. We want to have the modern experiences fully in on-premises, but it depends on the timing. It depends on so many factors on what we can actually put back in on-premises side. But I would say that there's clearly a massive demand still. It is going down, but it depends on region and a country.
Yeah, I think everyone was quite surprised that the modern experiences didn't make it down into Feature Pack 2.
We can talk about that one after you answer. But
yeah, and I think there's some stuff I know that I'm not sure whether they told what the reasons why, so I'll let Vesa explain that. But the fact that now we have to wait to kind of midway through calendar year 2018 to even see preview bits of SharePoint Server 2019 is a good and a bad thing, because I feel like there'll be a lot of organizations like, well, we really want this new modern experience, so all right, the cloud is okay and we'll move. And so I know Microsoft didn't do that on purpose, and it wasn't like a forcing function to get them to do it. There were some technical things they couldn't do it in Feature Pack 2.4. But it's going to be interesting, the behavior of some of these companies said, never, never, never cloud, that suddenly they're going to get pressure from the business going, but we want that modern experience, and we can't wait till GA of SharePoint Server 2019. I'm assuming in 2019, is it called 2019 or late 2018? Who knows?
Yeah, but I guess the interesting part of that will be, if you look at an enterprise, whenever there is something new in UX, they have to retrain people, they have to do all of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they don't do it overnight. So probably by the time they would do, if they got it now, by the time they're done, there is vNext available, right? So do they start from start because there is more, or, right? So there might be also interesting aspect, like how, when they will be ready and what will be the right moment for them to start doing that, actually.
And there's realities of life and in this discussion as well. So if you think about, for example, the Feature Pack 2. So the Feature Pack 2 was forked back in May, June from the SharePoint Online, which is kind of cool. We are using the same bits in the on-premises, which we're using in online, but we always fork that at some point. And then that is the time when you get the capabilities on-premises. As an example, SharePoint Framework extensions, we released those a week ago. So there's no way we could have had SharePoint Framework extensions in on-premises because the
I'm sure that merge branch would have been really easy, Vesa.
Oh yeah, yes. It's only all of the UIs of SharePoint which we need to test, right? Test.
I don't know what all the fuss is about.
How hard can it be, right?
And then so that's kind of explains why the full modern experiences is not there. We might have had some modern experiences, but then we didn't actually even have a GA for communication sites. We didn't have GA for all of the modern care capabilities in modern sites. It would not have made any sense to push out a partial experience, which would have probably just caused more negative feedback. And then now people are randomly asking that, okay, fine, the Feature Pack 2 didn't have modern experiences and blah, blah, blah. What about Feature Pack 3? Okay, let's be practical. And I'm just putting my ex-principal consultant hat on and being practical. Would it make sense for Microsoft to do end-to-end testing of all UIs in SharePoint 2016 as part of the Feature Pack 3 release?
Of course.
If we modernize all of the UI.
Of course.
Let's think about the investment of that and the resources and everything else versus, obviously,
you're going to make him angry, Waldek.
Yeah, we're Microsoft. We have infinite resources, right?
Exactly.
Yes,
exactly.
You have teams, right? You have a team.
You have 75,000 employees. I mean,
True.
How hard can it be?
Just pick the phone and call them. So.
Yes.
Yeah. Can I ask one more question that popped up here in the Q&A, which is, I was just wondering, any lawyers in the room? Because Jens asks, just one question about trust. When I trust, what legal considerations does the service provider have to fulfill?
So I can answer that from a Hyperfish perspective, because we had to go through all this when we launched the service. So we have the consent of the application. So I'm hoping everyone on this call goes to www.hyperfish.com/try. You can actually experience this in a tenant.
Do you trust them? No.
And basically, from a declaration perspective, we're asking for read permissions to the directory profiles, and you click consent. And what that does is that then tells Azure Active Directory that if the Hyperfish application wants to reach in and read your directory information, Hyperfish can. Until if you went into Azure Active Directory portal, you can actually rescind that consent as well. So you're in control of the access that we have as a service provider. From a legal perspective, on top of that, we provide a privacy document that is on our website. And that's actually a legal requirement that we have to do, where we declare what we do with that information. So if we read that directory information, where do we store it in our service? In our case, we don't store it unless it's a change that they're making to their directory profile, because we're all about keeping profile information up to date. But the other aspect of it is that we'll actually say what fields that we're reading to and from. So because the consent is quite broad, and the directory one isn't too bad because you can either read directories or you can write directories. But if you look at something like the consent permissions for SharePoint lists and libraries, that can be really broad. Like if you consent to me that I can read and write to SharePoint, that's huge, because there's no like security permissions that you can do that really reduces that consent down to the sites that you want me to have access to. And so in that case, with our kind of privacy and our security statements, we will say that, you know, if our product says that you only want us to reach into this particular site, that's all we'll do. And I think that, you know, the consent definitions is one way of controlling what an application can do, but you also have to trust that the privacy statement and the EULAs and so forth is the legal binding thing that says this is what we will do with that consent, if that makes sense.
So I'm not a lawyer, but having sat in endless workshops about GDPR, which is a hot topic, is probably the best summary out of that and privacy and the cloud is don't do stupid stuff.
I would like to step in there and announcing that on the 24th of October, Paolo Pialorsi will do a webinar that we will host about GDPR. We'll have a slide coming up later where the URL where you can sign up for that one. But, back to the technology again, and that's related to basically to what Vesa and I demoed, and I'm pretty excited about it. But we demoed during Ignite, and it seems that people are really excited about it too, because every time we talk about it or demo it, people are like, "Wow, finally, site designs." Or as it used to be known, recipes, and as it has been called, site scripts. But site scripts is now a thing, and the site design is a thing.
Yes.
Can I ask a question about it?
Yeah,
So what's
the person
official name
responsible
now?
is there, sort of.
Awesome. He's somewhere here. So can I do a save as, like, can I build a SharePoint site exactly how I want it to be, and then do save a site template and then use that as a stamp?
Nope. No, you cannot.
Nope.
Not yet, or is it I just know it will never be the case?
So fair point. So when we get started, we will have a really subset of actions which will be applied on top of the site. So you're able to configure like, hey, I want to apply a custom theme, I want to create a list, I want to add a column to the list, which quite often isn't sufficient. So the key point what we have in the V1.0 is the extensibility point. So we are able to then call a flow, and the flow can then call your Azure in a secured way. So you're able to then execute code as part of the site provisioning. So if something isn't supported natively, you can do that by yourself. And that's what we showed together with Erwin in Ignite. I did a long demo on that one earlier today in the PMP call, which will be live in YouTube. Well, it's going to be live tomorrow anyway. But now the sweet spot would be save site as a template. The problem, or let me rephrase that, I'm an ex-consultant. The challenge of that one is that the site recipes are not like classic on.xml files or web templates or the site recipe, a site model as in the PMP. You can't really save the existing site. Site recipes, site scripts, site designs, whatever we call them, they're actions. So it's actions like in Azure. You're defining an action, apply a theme, create a site. It's not that you're defining this is going to be the list, and these are going to be the columns within the list, and these are going to be the settings within the list. So the approach is slightly different. At some point, yes, if there's an interest, if there's a demand, if the priorities are met in engineering, yes, you can potentially save an existing site as a site design or a site script, which will then do a delta comparison between out-of-the-box site and your existing site. Now, until that day, you can still use PMP provisioning and PMP remote provisioning to match that gap or breach that gap.
So you're saying that I should bring back SP source?
The what?
There was come on. There was an open source project that we did that you pointed at a site and it created the XML definitions of all the objects in there. I mean, technically you could do this, right? But I guess if the product team's they're gonna get pressure to do it. So I'll just wait.
Sure, yeah. But how long does it take? I don't know. It depends on the demand. By end of this year, by end of this calendar year, we'll get the first version of the site designs out with let's say 10 to 12 probably actions.
So for the theming and templates, we shouldn't be doing master pages anymore. We can use the out-of-box themes. We can use these new custom theme templates thingies.
Correct.
We can do custom CSS as we like. What about design manager-based packages? They're still available, right?
Well, for now, the site designs and site recipes are only for the modern experiences. So you cannot even use a custom master page, even though you would like to do that, because you can't. There's no way for doing a custom master page in the modern sites. Same applies for the design packages. Design packages are only for the classic publishing sites. And yes, absolutely support it. We are actually even investing on that area, making them faster. But it's not where the site design can be used.
Okay, so now we have kind of a split approach for classic and modern sites.
Yep.
True. Anyway, technically site design packages, sorry, what are those? Site packages, design packages, the old publishing packages.
Design packages, I think.
Naming. So those are actually sandbox solutions. So they are actually quite evil if you start analyzing what they do in the longer run. And if you go back on analyzing how they're being built, what's the long-term impact for your publishing site even. Therefore, if you're planning to use a custom master page, which is supported, not necessarily recommended in a classic publishing, we would still recommend to use remote provisioning techniques like PnP provisioning or whatever alternative third-party remote provisioning technique, rather than falling back on design packages or which are sandbox solutions. They're evil. They will bite you.
Oh, you said the word. You said the word now.
Yes. Sandbox solutions.
Right. I'm sorry to be a party pooper here, but we have to slowly start to close down here. I want to thank you, all of you, for being here. I think we had a great discussion. I hope that the people attending got something out of it. If I dare to say, almost sure, because I learned stuff, so that was really good. Let me go back to the presentation and show you a few more things here. So this should be visible right now. And let me go to the next slide. So, as I said, on October the 24th, we will have a similar webinar. This one is done by Paolo Pialorsi, my good friend from Italy. And as someone said, when he presents, SharePoint never sounds as elegant as he talks when he talks about it, especially when he does that together with Luca Bandinelli, two Italian states talking with an Italian accent about SharePoint. It's amazing.
What about the Godfather film all over again?
Exactly. So Paolo will do a webinar, free to attend. Please sign up on the URL and learn more about GDPR from an Office 365 perspective. Thank you for attending. We will, as we said in the beginning, we recorded this webinar, and all of you that signed up will receive a link where you can download and view this webinar again. And to all the guys joining in here, thank you for today. I had a great time.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you, Erwin.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.